There's a whole lot of arguments that go on around teacher workload and teacher shortages and the relationship between those two things. And to also get inside that intensification argument that teachers' work over time has become increasingly intensified.
We are seeing curriculum being outsourced. We are seeing solutions that are coming into schools that are trying to, in some ways, reduce that decision-making fatigue for teachers.
I'm worried about the outsourcing. I'm worried about it because I think that the curriculum making space for teachers, that's actually where a lot of the intellectual heart of the work of teaching lies.
Hey everyone, I'm Cat Vo, and you're listening to In the Classroom. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Alrighty, everybody. Today we are in the classroom with Professor Nicole Mockler. Nicole, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kat.
Nicole, why don't we kick off the podcast with your journey into education and what you were like as a student and how you became so interested in educational policy?
Sure. Okay. Look, I think, school, I loved school, but I probably loved the socials of school more than the academic bits of school, to be honest. I don't think any of I wasn't a hopeless student, but I just was not the kind of classic straight A student. I don't think any of my teachers would. I'm just kind of running through some of the ones that were important to me. No, I don't think any of them would take issue with that assessment. But I was a first-in family university student. My parents were really like I was going to uni. There was no doubt about that. But they were really concerned that I would have something that was going to qualify me to do something at the other end. So my real passion when I left school was ancient history. And my parents said, well, that's all very well and good, but where's that going to lead? And I was adamant that I wanted to do a major in ancient history, and they were pretty adamant that, something that was going to actually lead to a kind of identifiable career would be a good thing. So I ended up enrolling in a Bachelor of Education with honours in ancient history. So I did that degree and I thought I was going to do the PhD in ancient history, but I went out to school. I had really enjoyed my education degree. I went out to school to teach for a little bit and I did a master's in history in the first couple of years of teaching, just a part-time one. Wouldn't recommend it. Looking back on it, why did I do that? But anyway, did that. And then I remember I finished my master's and I have this really strong memory of standing in the kitchen at my school, washing up my coffee cup with my principal standing next to me. And I said to her, I've just finished my MA. And she said, you're going to do more study. What are you going to do? And I said, I don't know, I still want to do the PhD, but I kind of don't feel that I'm ready. I was like 24 at this point. And she said, if you want to study something else, why don't you study curriculum? We don't know enough. We don't have a teaching profession that knows enough about, what curriculum actually is, what its role is, what it does. And I went, that's kind of interesting. So I did a little bit of reading and then I enrolled in an MED and the rest is kind of history. And then I rolled that into an EdD and then I rolled that into the PhD. And so it was a long time between. I think I had that conversation with my principal must have been about 1996. I finished the PhD in 2008. So there was a while in there. But that was kind of that was my trajectory. And in the meantime, I'd become a head of department and then I went on to be a director of learning in another school. And along the way, I'd really fallen in love with teacher professional learning and seeing that as the way of supporting teachers to constantly develop their practice. And a way more than that of supporting professional renewal and keeping teachers connected to the purpose of what they were there to do, keeping them connected to not the constant need to innovate just because, but the constant need to develop your practice over the course of your career so that you're not teaching the same year 20 years in a row. And so eventually when I finally got to the point where I was, okay, now I'm going to do the PhD, it became a study of the development of teacher professional identity and the way that teachers understand themselves in their work and in the world, where those understandings come from and what the role of things like professional development are in shaping those identities. So
I remember being at university and reading your paper on quality teaching and quality teachers. And that discourse was incredibly enlightening as a teacher that was studying teaching. And my question to you is, and this is a very big question, but how would you describe the current policy environment that teachers are currently in right now?
Look, well, it is a really big question. I don't think. I think we have a tendency in education policy, and this is not a criticism of any particular side of politics, because they tend to have a kind of bipartisan understanding of what goes on in schools, and what should go on in schools. But I think that there is a lack of understanding of the complexity of teachers' work. I think that there's an over-reliance on, the great sociologist of education, Dan Lorty, talked about the apprenticeship of observation that everyone has, because, we're all in classrooms for 13 years, most of us these days. And so that gives us a sense of what the teacher's work is. But the thing is that it doesn't give us access to the backstage. It doesn't give us access to all of the things that go on behind the scenes. Teaching is not just an act of standing up in front of a class and doing something. It's an intellectual activity, and there are a whole lot of things that go on behind the scenes that as students we don't have access to. I think sometimes we don't have access to enough of it, but that's a whole other story. So I think that a lot of policy is informed by this idea that, well, we know what it is. It's a simple thing. You go to school, the teacher teaches, the students learn, and I mean, how hard can it be? And so that informs a whole lot of discussion that we have in the public space about what teachers should do, and an idea that, there's this kind of idealistic best practice out there that we can all just, if we could all just, why won't they get on board and just do that thing, whatever that thing is? So I think it's an oversimplification that is really damaging to the teaching profession, that kind of a kind of circumscription, a limitation, I guess, of ideas about what teaching is, that I think is really problematic. And I think it's hard for teachers to speak back to that. And professional associations do a great job of that kind of work, but it's hard work. It's really demanding work. And so I guess that's one answer to that very, very, very big question.
You referenced before about intellectual activity and decision making that teachers engage in. And I know that your research has also tapped into this space about the amount of decisions that teachers make per day. So can you shed a bit of light onto that study and what you found from that?
Yeah, I mean, so this is part of a big Australian Research Council funded study that I've been part of with my colleagues Greg Thompson and Anna Hogan from QUT and Megan Stacey from UNSW. And we were really in this study wanting to get inside the question of teachers and time, to understand a little bit more about the debates that we're having at the moment about teacher workload. There's a whole lot of arguments that go on around teacher workload and teacher shortages and the relationship between those two things. And to also get inside that intensification argument, the argument that's been around for a long time now, that teachers' work over time has become increasingly intensified. And so some of the work that we did within this project was to develop a little app that allowed teachers to track their work in real time, well, almost in real time. So the idea is that teachers signed up to the study, and we recruited, our partner on the study was the Queensland Teachers Union. So we recruited 3 Queensland public schools. And teachers would sign up. They would say, yep, I would be happy to complete the app on, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday of next week, and then the app would randomly give them a half-hour period during that time. So they couldn't say, I'm going to take a point in time where I know I'm going to be teaching, or I know I'm going to be not teaching, but rather, here's your half hour, tell us what you did. And what we found within that study, in the first phase of the study, we were in classrooms with teachers, observing them and then comparing our observations to what they had told us they were doing. And we discovered there that although we could see teachers making an awful lot of decisions in that 30-minute or 60-minute period, that when teachers were asked to nominate how many decisions did you make, they're like, oh, maybe 3. It's kind of like, well, you might think back and you think there were 3 key moments, but the fact is that, you made this decision. I could see you made a decision to either go down the back of the classroom and kind of sort out what was happening there because there were some kids that were distracted, or in fact not to go down the back of the classroom, but to just kind of do the eyes on me thing and bring the kids back in that way. That's a decision. And although it's a minor thing, if you went down there and aggravated a situation that didn't need to be aggravated, well, then your lesson goes in a whole other direction that you probably didn't want. So those kinds of decisions are actually really important, but they might be the kind of tacit decisions that teachers don't always think of when they think of the number of decisions that they make. Anyway, we've developed ideas around time poverty and about the role of teachers and decision making. When you sit teachers down and say, okay, you said 3, I said 33. Let's talk about the difference between them. And you start to talk, oh, well, yes, of course. Well, I was definitely thinking about that while that was happening, and I did make a decision to do that. But, the big decision points in the lesson were kind of the ones about, when do we start? When do we change direction? Do we drop this activity and move on to the next thing now? Do I let it go for another 5 minutes? But our argument is kind of that part of the work that makes teachers feel so time poor is around the number of decisions that they make every day. And so there's a kind of need to get inside teachers' work in order to understand that. Because it's a really powerful part. It's a really important part of the work that teachers do. And it goes to this question of professional judgment, the kind of the importance of teacher professional judgment and the importance of us, I guess, not allowing that decision making that we do in the moment to just be tacit, but to understand that that's part of what makes the work so exhausting.
And I've heard you say that it's often about the nature of those decisions as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is. So it's not just about the kind of number of them, but about the intensity of them as well. And when it comes to things in the classroom that are often about the relationships between people and the way that the classroom is a social space, and the teaching and learning that happens in the classroom, despite the way that it might be talked about in education policy, is not about one person up the front saying stuff and a whole lot of people receiving stuff. It's actually about a social interaction. And so every one of those decisions, or the vast majority of those decisions, has the capacity to impact those relationships in some way. And now that doesn't mean that, if I make a decision to go and talk to this kid, that it's going to be a life-altering or even lesson-altering thing. But it does mean that the constant thing behind that decision-making for teachers is often about what this will do to the relationship, what this will do to that social space in the moment, and also what it might do over time as well. So, there are all of those things going on that actually make the decision-making thing, quite intense.
Can you comment on this current, I guess, era of reform where we are seeing curriculum being outsourced? We are seeing solutions that are coming into schools that are trying to, in some ways, reduce that decision-making fatigue for teachers, but in another way is actually exacerbating the problem that I think teachers actually, they do want to spend time in curriculum and in planning, and we do have this tension. And so for me as a teacher, I guess my question to you is, how can I be navigating that? What might that look like?
Yeah, look, I think I'm worried about the outsourcing. I'm worried about it because I think that the curriculum making space for teachers is not just lesson planning. It's not just making resources from scratch. It's none of those things. That's actually where a lot of the intellectual heart of the work of teaching lies. And I know myself, even now teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students, I still get that creative buzz from working out how am I going to do this thing? Like how will I create the conditions for these students in this moment to learn this particular thing? And what do I need to put in place in order to make that happen? And I think that I think that creative and intellectual buzz is a really important part of the process. It might happen in the backstage of teachers' work, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. So I worry about the outsourcing. I don't worry about teachers. I don't worry about teachers. There was a whole lot of discourse a couple of years ago about, teachers are downloading their lessons from YouTube. It's like, where do we go on YouTube to find lessons? I don't know. Like, what? It doesn't even make sense. A lesson is not a thing that exists on YouTube that is downloadable. But I think it was referring to the fact that, you come to teach a new topic. It might be something that you've never done before. It might be something you studied at university. But, as a history teacher and an English teacher, often it would be the case that, suddenly we're doing T.S. Eliot. Well, I didn't actually study T.S. Eliot as part of my English major, but I know how to read poetry. I know how to read literary criticism. I take myself away. I do all of those things. And I come back with ideas about how I'm going to work with my students on this. Now, it's not a problem to be accessing resources from elsewhere and pulling them together, but teachers' curriculum work is actually about thinking about who my students are, where we need to get to, and then what the best path is going to be for them to do that. And if we try and outsource it so that we're, talking about, whole unit plans that have got slide decks that are, there's a problem in that I think goes beyond the quality of the experience that students get in the classroom. And I think it goes to that question around teachers and creativity and being connected into the work that they do, because they're educated to use their judgment, to be critical thinkers, and to exist in that social space of the classroom, bringing their pedagogical content knowledge with them in order to support the learning of their students. And when we say, here's a slide deck, just stick to that, I don't think that it doesn't get to the heart of what teaching actually is.
I just feel fatigued hearing that, because that is exactly my experience in so many different ways. And I think that is also compounded by the media discourse around that. And I know that your work with analyzing 65,000 print media articles for how that has positioned teachers as well has also been so profound. And so, can you comment on the things that you found in your study when you did that analysis and some of the discourses that us as teachers should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think I started thinking about this work while I was doing my PhD. So my PhD study was, as I said before, about teacher professional identity. I had 8 teachers in my study and I interviewed them 6 times each over the course of for some of them it was a school year, for others it was a little bit longer. One of the things I was doing at the same time was thinking about how to understand teacher professional identity. I swear I'll get to the media piece in a minute, but how to understand teacher professional identity as a kind of thing that sat in the confluence of my personal experience, my professional context, and then the external kind of political public piece. And so one of the things that I did as part of that study was to look at some of the prominent education journalists of the day and to actually see what kinds of stories they were writing, what happened over the course of a year or a year and a half with each of those journalists. And then in my interviews with teachers, I asked them about, the kinds of things in the public space that kind of got into the way that they, that fed into the way that they understood themselves and their work. And what I found in that study was that while I think all 8 of the teachers were, happy to talk about how annoying it was that, teachers were represented this way or that. And, then that flowed over into conversations that you had on a Saturday night where people were going on about how, you have all those holidays and you only work till 3 o'clock every day. And, why can't the media actually, help to combat some of that? That it was not a huge thing for any of those 8 teachers at that time. Now, that's almost 20 years ago now. And I would say, fast forwarding over that time, the media coverage of education has grown in quantity. I wouldn't say it's grown in quality. Look, and this is not an argument about journalists and journalistic practice. It's an argument about the way that messages about education proliferate. And I don't think that it all comes from journalists because, a lot of the time they're reporting on what politicians have said and a lot of time they're reporting on what some reviewers said. So it's really complex. Again, it's not a simple thing. Um, but my research certainly showed that we are very, very interested in stories about education in Australia. That I did a little bit of a comparison. So my study was based on, as you said, 65,000 articles. They were every article that used the word teacher and or teachers 3 times or more. In the 12 national and capital city daily newspapers from 1996, the beginning of 1996 to the end of 2020. So I created a thing called the Australian Teacher Corpus, and then I analysed it, and I analysed it using corpus linguistic approaches and discourse analysis. Um, when I first collected the articles, I thought, I don't even know if that, I mean, it seems like a lot, but is that a lot? I don't know. So I did a kind of ready reckon. I looked at some other professions and thought, okay, well, what else? If I was doing this study on doctors, if I was doing it on nurses, if I was doing it on accountants, and I found that no, actually, it is a lot. And even the fact that in the final year of the corpus, 2020 was it was a wild year on a lot of levels. It was a wild year in the Australian Teacher Corpus as well. But even when you took into account the fact that there were a lot of media articles that referred to doctors and nurses during 2020 because of the pandemic, still there was a lot more reporting going on education. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think it is something that people are interested in because, we all went to school and we all have some experience and, many people have kids at school at some time or another. So, there are ways that school connects with the everyday experience. I think it's a policy area that is often discussed in the public space, again, because it's a way of galvanizing people. Politicians talking about tax policy, for example, like, sure, I mean, everyone pays tax, but there's not a kind of immediate reference point there that there is for most people for education. I mean, this is my surmising 65,000 articles later. But so I looked at change over time. I looked at the way that that articles that talked about teachers a lot also, there were very frequent references to the names of politicians. There were very frequent references to kind of, policy in adjacent areas. Um, and I traced the discourse of teacher quality over that time. So quality was a really important word in the Australian teacher corpus. I think it was. I think it was in the top 1.5% of words by frequency. So, so you told me I didn't need to do any preparation for this, and yet it would have been helpful if I'd just read that front of the book. No. I think I do have it in my head. So it was in the top 1.5% of words across the whole corpus. Now, the thing about that is that the vast majority of those top 1.5 are grammatical words like are, the. I mean, that the would be the most frequent word in the corpus. So it was a super important word in the corpus. And so I asked some questions of it about, well, what kind of quality? What are we talking about? What is quality a kind of proxy for? And I traced the word quality back to 3 different discourses. So one about teaching, so the idea of teaching quality, of quality teaching, sometimes linked to the quality teaching model, but more often just about, an idea about teaching being of quality. One that was a kind of general idea about education, so quality education. So the idea that we need to have a quality education system that, does all of the things that we need it to do for our children and young people. And then the third one was teacher quality. So the phrase teacher quality itself, but also quality of the teacher, quality of teachers. So I kind of, in identifying these discourses, I kind of bundled all of the phrases that I could think of that would point to that particular discourse. Then I went back and read again. I added a few more. So that over the 25-year period, I could actually kind of map these 3 discourses. And what I found was that there's been a real growth in the discourse of teacher quality over that time. That it kind of peaked, I think, between 2007 and 2013. So the Australian education revolution kind of years, and then fell off a little bit, beyond 2013 after the passage of the Australian Education Bill. But one of the things about the discourse of teacher quality is that it really, when we think about it in terms of teacher identity, it really tries to link the idea of quality to the person of the teacher. So it's not about practice, but about your quality, your personal quality, Kat, and how good you are. Not about the practices that you engage in and the way that within your classroom you can strive to improve those practices. I don't know a teacher. I know a lot of teachers, but I've never met one who was not interested in thinking about the practices that they engage in and how I might work to do this thing better. Because it's never possible to do it perfectly. I could probably count on one hand the number of lessons either at school or at university that I've walked out of thinking there is nothing that could have made that better. Mostly it's just, I wish I hadn't done this. I wish I'd thought about that. I wish, if only I'd shaped that slightly differently. Maybe we should have stopped that activity and moved on and it would have given us more time. All of those kinds of things. Now, discussions of teacher quality kind of try and pin it. It's, assumes that teaching is embodied rather than practiced, which comes from some of the work of my friend and colleague Jenny Gore. And this idea that teaching is embodied rather than practiced is something that makes it difficult to have conversations about practice and about what we might do to improve practice, to shift practice, to keep developing practice in ways that, as I said at the beginning, kind of keep us connected to our students, keep us connected to the broader project of education.
Mm. I just love that explanation so much because I feel like as a teacher working on the ground that teachers are often the collateral damage of the press and we are the sole problem but also the sole solution to very systemic issues that require systemic change. And your work and distinction between quality teachers and quality teaching was profound for me at university because it helped me realize that distinction very early on. And so for the next generation of teachers, what what do you hope to see for them to become aware of these discourses? I mean, the first chapter of your book, Words Matter. What do you see for the next generation of teachers to become aware of this and the positionings of it?
Well, I mean, oh, I think I think there's a couple of things in there. I think, like thinking about the students that I teach at university now, there is a level of media savvy that I definitely did not have as a young person, and I think that the more that we can help to shape teacher education to provide students with the kind of critical skills that they need, and that critical thinking has always been an intrinsic part of teacher education. But I think, moving into environments where, we've got generative AI doing what generative AI will do, and who knows what it will do over the next decade. We need to be thinking about how to support young teachers and pre-service teachers to really run with that savvy that they've got and to build it and to think about what it means for their practice. And I think within that, there's a stream of it that is about media literacy and about understanding the way that they are positioned. I know these are things that we have conversations I teach students research methods and I teach them foundations of education. I know that these are discussions that we have about the way that teachers are depicted in the media quite a bit, just in the general run of discussion about education more broadly. So I think it is important for us to keep having those conversations with young teachers. And I don't think that I think understanding, I think holding on to that idea that teaching is complex and people outside of it don't always understand that. And that what that means is that the way that the work is portrayed in the public space, yes, it's going to make you angry sometime. And no, it's not. And look, I suspect that if I was a surgeon, I would also be annoyed about the way that my work was portrayed in the public space as well. Okay, I don't think it's peculiar to teachers, but I think the amount of coverage and then the kind of attribution, as you said earlier, of a whole lot of systemic failures to the work of teachers. Everything from, well, why aren't they teaching this in school, to really inane debates about the whole inquiry-based learning versus explicit instruction thing. teaching is complex. Teachers need a whole range of different strategies that they can use with kids. I don't know a teacher that has practiced for any length of time without using explicit instruction. I would like to think that that in building student capacity to actually do their own critical thinking and to, learn about stuff, that we're going to engage a whole range of different pedagogical strategies. So the fact that, in the media there are often these kinds of views put about that, well, we need to focus, everyone should be doing this. This is best practice. This is a no-brainer. There probably are a few no-brainers in education, but, what we actually need to understand within the profession and the way that our profession is understood outside are two quite different things.
Part of that issue, Nicole, is also the work of researchers and the accessibility of that work to teachers as well.
Yep.
And so my question to you is, how can researchers make that more accessible to teachers, and what does that take? Because we have commercial products that are coming into schools that are a lot more easy to access,
Yeah.
easy to understand, and the work of researchers just seems to be this offside aspect when it's incredibly enriching, and there's intellectual work and knowledge within that teachers crave and desire, and they're hungry
Yeah.
for it. So what's your message to researchers in that space?
Yeah, look, I think we've become better in the last few years at getting a lot of our work out from behind the paywall. And I think most of us, as educational researchers, can take absolutely no credit for that because there was a deal done by the Coalition of Australian University Librarians, so the professional body for university librarians, with many of the big publishing houses back in about 2018, 2019. That means that there are many, many more open access articles being published by Australian researchers in particular these days. So I think that that's one thing. I don't think necessarily that having it out beyond the paywall means that it is going to be accessible to teachers. And that's not because teachers are, unable to read academic work, but it's because, time poverty, right? It's like I've got limited time as a teacher. I've got a lot of things that I need to do. Going off and reading Mockler's 236 pages on media representations of teachers, I understand that that is probably not at the top of the list. So I think it's incumbent upon us to try and do that important translational work. And to provide ways for teachers to come in. And so, I think part of that is about, doing things like this, in fact, and having conversations in spaces where teachers can access those. And, maybe on their drive to work, they're listening to this conversation and thinking, yeah, that makes me think, about something that happened last week, or it makes me think about, something that I might think a little bit more about and go and do some further reading on. So I think there are those kinds of things. But I think one of the things is that good research takes time. It's not ever something that can happen in a hurry. It takes time to conceptualize it. It takes time to design it. It takes time to gather the data and to think about what it means and to come up with something that is, that makes a contribution. And so we're kind of up against it in a way because when you operate without all of those constraints, and that's not to say that there are not some commercial enterprises out there that are doing great work, but when you operate without those constraints, it becomes a lot more easy to be agile and to be quick. So the question for us as researchers, I think, is how do we manage to do the translational work? How do we manage to have maybe a little more of that agility without compromising the quality of what we do, and without moving into a space where we're trying to do fast research just for the sake of doing it. Because fast research doesn't usually equate with good research. I mean, unless you've got $1 squillion and a massive team of people that are all able to just put everything aside. But academia doesn't work like that either. So generally speaking,
To close, Nicole, what's your message to school leaders and to teachers as well?
Look, I think, that's hard. I think if I had a message, it would be to say that I feel like as a society we need to trust teachers a lot more. And that's not just to say you've got all the expertise, it's all neutral, it's all great, and but I think we need to develop a higher level of trust within the profession. And I think part of that is about those of us who work in the teaching profession and around it, people like me, that we actually get better at communicating and at speaking into the public space about the complexity of the work, the importance of the work, what it looks like when it's done well, about how there actually isn't one form of best practice. There's nothing that will work everywhere. Everything, as Dylan Williams says, everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. So we need to think about educational practice in ways that are connected to an understanding of the purpose of education. What is it that we're here to do? Are we here to generate great test scores or, excellent leaving scores? Are we here to actually educate the next generation of people so that they will be well equipped for the lives that they will live into the end of the 21st century, knowing that we do not know what that holds? What is that purpose, and then how do we as a profession and around that as a society come to a more complex understanding of what good teaching is?
Nicole, I wish we could go for an hour, but we can't. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your expertise with us, and for the work that you do representing teachers every day in the profession and in the public space as well. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thanks for having me, Kat.